The Yeti ASR is back.
Talking money, don't talk to me. I be over here where the bosses be.
This is a super cool lightweight XC whip with some kind of retro styling. Although I can confirm it does not ride like an old XC bike. This thing is at the pointy end of the category with some modern geometry, some surprisingly nice suspension, and all the bells and whistles. So stick around to see what it's all about.
Let's cover a couple of talking points before we go ride this bike. The ASR is available in 2 frame types. You've got Turk and Carbon, both of which are carbon. Turk is just a little bit lighter and nicer. Interestingly, there is a unique build here, and it's called the Ultimate build. It uses a Turk frame, but it removes some of the cable ports on that frame to save even more weight. If you're into cutting absolutely every last gram, that Ultimate build might be for you. Keep in mind, you're only going to be able to run wireless drivetrains. So now let's go ride this thing. It's been a few months since I've ridden a full-blown XC bike, and man, the pedaling efficiency and the weight is refreshing. I seem to be getting heavier and heavier the more kids I add to the family roster. So the ASR was really nice to climb because it made up for a good portion of that. This thing climbs exactly how you'd want an XC bike to climb. I spent quite a bit of time riding the ASR with Zach. And if you know Zach, you know he rides bikes more than pretty much anybody else on the planet. And as a consequence, he's kind of fit. Don't hold this against him, but sometimes he even likes to go out and just pedal, even if there's no like fun and exciting downhill involved. Serial killer behavior aside, he's pretty quick on the climbs, but the ASR was enough for me to be able to keep up. And in fact, this is the first time that I can ever remember that Zach asked for a water break. The point is proven, the ASR climbs very well. Let's chat a little bit more about how it does it. ASR is firm and efficient. It's not quite as firm as something like the Orbea Oath. It's not as active and plush as something like the Santa Cruz Blur. The lockout lever on the bars was never used, if that gives you any idea of the efficiency on the ASR. But it doesn't go as far as being too efficient. It strikes a nice balance between efficiency and traction and comfort. It's one of the few XC bikes that I could stand up and mash on the pedals and still have some degree of traction. And before you talk about tires, this has the same stock rear tire that pretty much every other XC bike on the planet comes with. It certainly doesn't hurt that the ASR is one of the lightest bikes I've ever thrown a leg over. My build comes in at 25.1 pounds, even with alloy wheels. With a couple of smart choices, you could easily get this thing under 25 pounds without compromising the ride quality. The angles are a little bit more relaxed on the ASR, but the cockpit is still very traditional XC. It's got a 55mm stem and very horizontally challenged 740mm bars. And as a consequence, your weight does end up pretty far over the front. You kind of have that quick, sharp handling feel that you'd traditionally have on an XC bike. While that does add a couple of climbing points, I do kind of want to see how this would handle with a traditional trail cockpit setup. So to sum up climbing on the ASR, I'd describe it as a pleasant affair. And that's coming from a guy who really likes chairlifts and tailgate pads. It's quick, efficient, and snappy without going overboard and feeling like you're riding a 2x4. It's comfortable and offers just enough traction to be a good technical climber as well. So downhill. I'm not much of a dainty rider on the downhills, and I end up riding every bike like it has 160mm of rear wheel travel. Turns out that's a recipe for breaking things on bikes that don't have 160mm of rear wheel travel, which I've done my fair share of lately. I was hell-bent on not breaking this bike. On my first ride on the ASR, I told myself I was going to ride this like an XC bike and do XC bike things, and that lasted all of about 22 seconds before I realized this bike is way too fun and way too capable to ride like that and putter around and dodge every little rock and bump. To be honest, caught me a little bit off guard. Also, to my delight, I didn't have to send that awkward email to Yeti telling them I had just broken their cool new toy. Don't take any of that the wrong way. The ASR is still an XC bike. It's not a trail bike. That's what the 120 was designed for. Instead, the ASR is an XC bike designed for the rigors of modern XC racing. Have you seen a World Cup XC track lately? Most of us jabronis would pucker at some of those features, even on our 160mm bikes. The ASR is designed to at least partially cover your butt on head-high drops while you're maxing out the watts. I found it surprisingly capable and calm through the chatter and rough terrain. And I guess that does make sense. It has a little bit slacker angles and a longer wheelbase than most other XC bikes. The suspension quality also makes up for some of that capability. It's surprisingly easy to get into that travel on the ASR. A lot of XC bikes are just so damn efficient that you can't get into the travel, and they don't provide any comfort or forgiveness through trail chatter. The ASR is efficient on the climbs, but not so much that it becomes a hardtail on the descents like some other bikes. Sure, there is not a lot of travel and the bike is not plush, but it's quite a bit more forgiving than I expected it to be. Some of that comfort and forgiveness comes from some flex in the frame itself. This isn't the stiffest frame I've ever ridden, and most XC bikes aren't. And that can be really nice, especially in this application. Most XC bikes aren't going to be recklessly pumped into bermed corners at the bike park or smashed through rock gardens with your heels down and no regard for human safety. So they don't have to be made extra stiff. Some of that frame flex is actually a good thing because it can take the sting and the vibration out of trail chatter. The ASR seems to have a pretty healthy dose of compliance, for lack of a better term. When you're doing XC things, you'll appreciate it. When you're being a dummy, trying to peel tires off, maybe not so much. The handling on the ASR stays pretty quick and zippy, and I'd like to know how much of that is due to the angles on the bike versus the cockpit setup itself, which, you know, is on the narrow side. All in all, I was very pleasantly surprised with the descending chops on the ASR. Had the brakes been big and stoppy, I would have felt a lot more comfortable pushing the pace on this bike. Then again, if that was the case, I may have actually had to send that email to Yeti. Now let's talk about a couple of comparisons, and the first one I want to bring up is the Santa Cruz Blur. The Blur TR is the most similar bike that I've ridden to the ASR. They have a similar suspension feel, similar geometry, and ride quality. The ASR pedals a bit quicker than the Blur. It seems to have a bit more purpose and drive on the climbs while not giving up too much on the descents. The ASR has slightly more forgiving geometry than the Blur, but overall a bit firmer and a more supportive suspension feel. They both get the job done for the category. I also can't help but think that if you put heavier tires, a standard trail cockpit, and a stiffer fork on either one of them, it would start to punch into that trail category just a little bit. Next up, let's talk about the Orbea Oeth, and this is a bike that is even more XC than the ASR. It has steeper angles, much firmer suspension, and a little less forgiveness. And because of that, I think it's probably a little bit better suited for pure XC racing, but maybe a little bit less ideal for general trail riding. The ASR is a bit more versatile because of that. It's more forgiving of mistakes, and it punches a little bit more above its weight class. And all of that means it opens up terrain that most other XC bikes just don't want to mess with. While the ASR might not be as fast as the Oeth, it's still a good XC bike and potentially could be a great XC race bike, especially in that endurance category. But it's also a really good XC bike for the non-racer. And now let's talk about the transition spur. And I mostly wanted to talk about this to set a benchmark for what the ASR is. So I did spend a weekend riding the ASR and the Spur back to back. One is a trail bike, one is an XC bike. And it becomes very apparent when you ride them back to back. So even with only 5 millimeters less rear travel on the ASR, these two end up riding pretty differently. And I think most of it comes down to the build. The fork, the tires, and cockpit make up most of that difference. So while the Spur is a short travel trail bike made to go around and over obstacles rather than through them, by comparison, it feels like a much more stable and capable bike than the ASR. The ASR is a few pounds lighter though, and it has quicker rolling tires, so it is also much faster than the Spur on the climbs. While the Spur doesn't really wow with its acceleration, the ASR does. So who is it for? If it hasn't been apparent up to this point, the ASR is for the XC rider. Whether you're racing XC and want to land yourself on the top step of the podium, or you're doing endurance events, the ASR is probably a really good option for you. If you shave your legs or like to wear Lycra, but now you want to start dabbling in fun bikes without curly bars, the ASR would be a really good option for you because it's going to give you that efficiency and the snappiness that you expect and would hope to have out of a bike. But it will give you enough confidence and forgiveness that it won't murder you on the downhill. I also think the ASR is good for the non-racer. And maybe it's the like XC type rider or the light duty trail type rider who will appreciate the ASR. I will die before I admit downcountry as a category. So this is a little bit tricky though. You're most likely not going to be too comfortable riding double black diamonds on the ASR. It's just not meant for that. So if you're looking at this as a light duty trail bike, you're going to want to keep this in the chill blue, green, maybe soft black diamond rating, unless you like shitting your pants. As long as you go into it knowing that it's an XC bike or light duty trail bike that would rather climb than go downhill, I don't think you're going to be too disappointed. Well, thanks for sticking around. We'll see you next time.